Welcome to the Faith is Not Blind podcast. I'm Eric Devonier. I'm here with Scott Samuelson, an emeritus faculty member of the English department of BYU Idaho. And this is a wonderful moment for me. This is a mentor of mine. Scott and I taught in the English department for a number of years, and I've really come to appreciate Scott's example as both a teacher and as a disciple. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Eric.
The first question we'd like to ask is just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, where you're from. Tell us a little bit about your family.
My parents were junior high sweethearts in Sandy, Utah. And the Second World War was very important in our family history. My father, from an early age, wanted to fly and got a job in California building airplanes during the Second World War. And by this time, he and my mother had decided to marry, and she went down to California to be with him. And he said to her, "Let's get married here, and when we get back to where there's a temple, I will take you to the temple." So they got married by their bishop at Forest Lawn and moved back. My dad joined the Air Force and became a war hero, the pilot of a Martin Marauder B-26, 60 combat missions.
Wow.
And but the dark side of that was that what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. These were young men who were putting their lives on the line every day, and they'd get back from a mission and they'd have a fifth of whiskey as their part of their monthly ration. Right. And I don't know how much early interest my father had in the church, but I think his, what we call a word of wisdom, his addictive behavior with tobacco and alcohol, were very hard on his body. He died at 49. Very hard on the marriage. My mother was disillusioned. I don't want to paint too bleak a picture here, but since we're talking a little bit about ambiguity, I think being a child in an alcoholic home was an important part of my upbringing. My mother, early on in the marriage, trying to save, as she supposed, the marriage, decided that she'd go along with my dad, and they went to a officers club party. She drank, she got sick, she threw up, and she said, from that moment, I decided that I wasn't going to go that route. I was going to be true to my roots, and I was going to embrace the church with or without Sam. And so she did. We traveled as an Air Force family all over. We went to Europe for the first time in 1954. I was 7. My father was stationed in the middle of France, and from there we went to Germany, then back to Paris, back to the States for a few years, and then back to Europe, or to Germany for 3 more years. So during the course of all of this, my mother became increasingly devoted to the church, and when we moved to a new place, she would take us, and she would become immediately active and take us with her. My father,
like through Europe and all those places.
all
that
over,
you were.
all over. And my father seldom, if ever, came. Sometimes he did, but and he was a binge drinker. Things would be great for 6 or 8 months, and then I'd come home from school and see the door closed and know that he'd be on a 10-day drunk or whatever. And so the church began to work for me. I had a close relationship with my mother. I loved my father, and he gave me many gifts. I mean, we played baseball together, and he taught me how to play golf and some other things, model airplanes we did together. But I wanted a priesthood father. And so I was blessed to have men in priesthood positions come into my life that I could identify, and they were sort of surrogate fathers.
So did that for you, did it create any tension for you as a young child to kind of have, that great influence that your father was, but had that difficulty, and then there were other men that sort of helped to round that kind of father example out, right? Round out that experience. Did it create any tension for you?
I don't know. It must have. I think the answer has to be yes, but I don't think I felt it. It was one of those things that you compartmentalize as a child, and I loved my father, but I mean, he would drive to a bar and he would take me with him, and I would sit in the car, and this happened repeatedly, and I think I was a late teen before I started analyzing what it was in his makeup that wanted me to be with him while he was doing that. It was, I don't know, I still am not sure exactly, but at one point as a 16 or 17-year-old, and I had told him this, I said, if this ever happens again, I'll walk home. And it was about a 5 or 6 mile walk, and I took back streets, so he couldn't find me. And I know that he wanted to connect with me, and I know that he battled his addiction. But I had a wonderful bishop, and David Homer Yarn Jr. He was a philosophy professor and religion professor at BYU. And I remember the day I was to be ordained an elder prior to going on my mission. And he invited my father to the priesthood meeting and invited him to stand in the circle. And that meant a lot to me to have these two fathers, as it were. One, my blood father, biological, and the other, my spiritual father, with their hands on each other's hands and on my head. And so David Yarn was a very important person in my upbringing. We moved to Orem finally when we left Europe when I began high school at Orem High School, and he was our bishop, and I just saw in him this wonderful combination of spirituality, service, intelligence, PhD in philosophy from Columbia, and good humor. And that became, for me, the model that I wanted to strive for.
Well, and what a beautiful image. I mean, I love that image of both of those men with their hands on your head, representing the things that they do and the love that they both had for you. And one of the things that's interesting, though, as you talk about the bishop and you talk about getting the Melchizedek priesthood, you also talk about your dad and driving to those bars and you being in the car. It sounds like you could have gone either way, right? Following one example or the other. So why for you did you follow that example of wanting to get the priesthood, of wanting to have that testimony in the gospel? What do you think was the catalyst for your own testimony?
Part of it was the negative. So I remember my father sitting on the couch in the living room in a dirty white terry cloth robe coming out of a 10-day drunk. And he was sitting there shaking, and I walked down the hall to go to school, and he turned his head and looked at me and said, "Never drink." And that two-word testimony of the word of wisdom was so powerful. And I had seen the pain that his drinking had brought to my mother, and he wasn't an abusive drunk. He was, and we, the four of us, were happy in our own way when things were good. We had wonderful travel experiences in Europe, and they were interested in education, and The other was just the reverse of that, seeing the happiness in families and in individuals who lived the gospel. And that's what I wanted. And I think my mother wanted that for me as well. So I've kind of left her out of this, but her influence certainly would be a major thing. Yeah. I will say that one of the great influences in my mid-teen years was the large, very active branch in Wiesbaden, Germany, where there was plenty of work for the few Aaronic priesthood holders. And I began to develop a taste for church service, just little things. I mean, preparing the sacrament, giving a talk. We gave talks frequently. And
what was it about that taste, though, that you liked?
It just felt centered. It felt true. It felt like that's where home was for me. I just resonated toward it. I must have needed that or wanted it. It just worked. Yeah, just worked for me. And then another really important moment for me came my freshman year at BYU. I had signed up for a Book of Mormon class with, I didn't know who the professors were, and even though my sister, 2 years older than I, gave me some suggestions, I had to fit it into my time schedule. So I'm sitting there at 7 o'clock, and a young graduate student walked in and said, you may have been expecting someone else, but I've just been assigned to this class. My name is Jeff Holland, and this is my first teaching experience in college. And of course, for a person like me who's looking for wonderful role models, pretty hard to beat him as a teacher, as a person with a testimony of the Book of Mormon. I took the second half of the Book of Mormon from him. By the second semester, I knew enough to get the card that would get me into his class.
Right.
So I had read the Book of Mormon under his guidance. It was the April General Conference that year, which happened to be on Easter Sunday, which happens every once in a while, as you know. Mm-hmm. And I had decided to go on a mission. Back in the 60s, there wasn't quite okay, everybody's going, you're of age, you're going, right? It was more of are you going to go? Do you want to go? And I decided that I did. But I knew that I needed the spiritual confirmation, especially about the Book of Mormon. I felt like it was true. I felt like the church was true. I didn't have any beefs with doctrines or practices or anything, but I wanted the spiritual confirmation. So I fasted. I borrowed this old transistor radio from my grandmother, drove up to the other valley, to the Salt Lake Valley, spent the night in my father's mother's home, went up to the canyon that Sunday morning of conference, and I believed that I could receive some kind of spiritual experience, so I parked the car and walked off the trail a little bit. Early April, there was still some snow, but it was lovely. So I knelt down and said a really long prayer, 5 minutes, and and sort of said, here I am, and this is what I have come for, and wilt thou help me understand how having a testimony will help me serve a good mission? Is the Book of Mormon true? And nothing happened, I thought. So I prayed again. I think it was another 6-minute prayer this time. I expanded. And I wasn't desperate that I wasn't getting an answer, but I was expecting an answer.
Yeah.
So I looked at my watch, and it was time for conference to start, and so I found a place to sit, and I put the transistor radio there and turned it on. And in the economy of God, it was through the Tabernacle Choir and the voice of the living prophets that the answer to my prayer came. And it came with such power and forcefulness, because the message was about Christ and his atonement and the resurrection, as that is administered through the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it was absolutely clear to me at the moment, and has been all these years, that that was irrefutable personal experience. And then, interestingly, there was a dividend blessing that I have wondered over all these years. And the only way I can explain that is when the conference was over and I picked up the radio and walked back toward my car, nature had become quickened, and my eyes and ears to perceive it, and everything I looked at, the water in the stream, the rocks, the trees, everything was aglow, and I was seeing it as I had never seen it before. It wasn't what we generally call a spiritual experience, but given the fact that I love art, and it was just a great gift to me, as if the Lord were saying, okay, here's the main thing, but by the way, this can be expanded to include the whole world.
Because it's interesting knowing you so well that it's almost as if God is speaking to you specifically with your love of art, both literary and other types of art. That it's just not only a testament of the restored gospel, but also a testament that He loves you and knows you.
Thank you. That's true. And I want to tie that into my patriarchal blessing, which I received when I was 12 years old. And the patriarch, Elder G. Smith, the patriarch of the church at the time, we were headed to Europe, and the blessing speaks over and over about teaching the gospel at home and afar. And this comes up 3 or 4 times in different places. And given that teaching has also been a foundation of my relationship to Heavenly Father's children and to His church, that seems also to be a personal message.
Yeah. And so, how have you tried to marry your love of the gospel with your love of teaching and your love of your students?
Can I ask you to ask me about complexity of?
Sure.
I mean, I want to answer that question, but my mind is on a slightly different tack. I want to. To this point, it sounds like, Well,
no. I mean, it's interesting to hear your story about your testimony and knowing where your testimony takes you with your teaching career and reaching out to students. And of course, I was interested in how that fit in with your students. But I also know too that part of that teaching and that giving of your testimony to your students has to do with the testing of that testimony, right? And that it comes from a very real and sincere place. I mean, it does already in the stuff that we know about you growing up and about your experiences with your mom and then your dad and then your bishop. And so we'll back up and ask that question. So with this testimony that you gain, right, up there in the mountains above Salt Lake, so from there, what happens with your testimony? How does it grow? I mean, there are certain experiences that you find, that you have to deal with uncertainty or with perplexity that you felt strengthened what you felt in those mountains?
Yes. Let me give you a couple of instances. This was, I think, before my mission. It might have been after. I was taking a philosophy class, and there was a young man in the class who was obviously very bright, charismatic, good-looking. I didn't know him well, but we chatted a little bit before class, and I asked him about the mission, and he said, "I've received a mission call." And I said, "Oh, great, where are you going?" And he said, "Well, I've decided not to answer it." And I thought, really?
Yeah.
And that was one of my first encounters, I think, with a person who had so many gifts, intellectual as well as other gifts, but who apparently didn't have the gift of faith and service, at least enough that would take him into the mission field. I also remember an experience with Dr. Bishop Yarn. I, in those days, became enthusiastic with the intellectual aspects of the church, and for me, a symbol of that was Dialogue magazine, and so I went into his office one day kind of enthusiastic about this. He would have none of it. I mean, it was complete. He saw some things that I didn't see about how that direction could lead to some disappointments. And I loved him so much and wanted to be like him so much, and yet I also wanted this intellectual church life.
Yeah.
And so I was a little perplexed by that.
So how did you find that intellectual church life? Like so I mean that experience, it seems well, I mean, I know it's formative, right? That you recognize that you have this desire. I know that you have that intellectual gift. So where do you take it from there, where you are using that intellectual gift and yet also marrying that with your testimony?
Yeah, I don't think I could have formulated it exactly that way when it happened,
Sure.
but I remember distinctly walking from his office. I know exactly the spot and the time, and this was my decision. It was a conscious decision. I am going to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. I'm going to follow the path that David Yarn has followed. I could be an intellectual if I chose to be, and I'm going to do the other one first. And so I've been interested in ideas, and I love talking and analyzing them, but I made that decision pretty early. And I think all of these experiences kept me on what I consider to be a very difficult mission. And I encountered perplexity on my mission.
What in particular?
Big time.
What
Well,
was it
I
about
mean,
it?
the basic idealism. I'm going to Germany to convert the Germans to the truth, and problems with apathy and companions, and
Sure.
My mission. Of course, I had authority issues because of my relationship to my dad, but my mission president and I didn't really click. There was an experience where a fellow missionary a sister missionary that I was sympathetic toward, had a psychotic episode, and her parents ended up coming and getting her, but I felt like that was not handled well, and so that was hard. How do you explain that? How? Anyway.
So how did you keep that experience though from changing some of these spiritual feelings and these idealistic feelings that you had earlier? How did you keep that from making you bitter or from souring you on some of the beliefs that you had?
Well, teaching was important because before my mission, despite the patriarchal blessing, I had thought that I would be an architect or something. And then in my very first city, in Aachen, they assigned me as a brand new missionary to teach 3 10-year-old German boys. And so this was great because I had lived in Germany and I had a little German from that, and I'd taken 2 semesters at BYU, and then the language training mission experience. I had wonderful teachers. And I got to teach these boys, and I could ask them any question about the language or anything, and it was fun. And periodically, when we got to teach the missionary discussions, of course, which wasn't very often, it was a great treat. So most of the teaching I did was in church, because I was in these tiny branches in central Germany, and they needed someone to give a talk. Elder, are you good for a talk today? Yeah. Can you teach the lesson? The teacher didn't show up. Can you teach the lesson? And I developed this love for teaching. And people would say to me, what are you going to do when you go back to America? Well, I'm a student, I'm at the university. Well, what did you study? Well, general education. Well, what are you going to do with that? Well, I don't know. I really like teaching. And over the course of 2 years being asked this frequently, I came to the realization, and I think this was a spiritual gift, that the Lord, line upon line, opened to me the vision of my future career. And the way that career has played out, even though I taught at the University of California at Irvine when I was getting my PhD, and I taught at the Air Force Academy Prep School, so I haven't always taught in church settings. Yeah. But when the opportunity came to be at Ricks College and then stay, and even in my post-retirement, going to SVU, I have this yearning to serve by leading discussions about English or literature or writing in a setting where the principles of the gospel can be dovetailed with the secular so-called literature.
So is it that dovetailing? Is that the thing that the benefit that you felt all those years ago in Germany? The feelings of restoration that you got, spiritual restoration from teaching those boys, or is that interlocking? Is that what you felt was the thing that kind of kept you going spiritually?
Yes, and the conversations with a few of the members, but especially with fellow missionaries, that we'd talk about some of the problems that we were encountering and some of the gray areas or ambiguities in the gospel or in missionary life or whatever, and that those conversations and explorations through language, I was determined to keep going. Yeah. They didn't call them trainers back then, but I was a trainer to, I think, 5 new elders. And 4 of them went home early from their missions. This is what I mean by sort of an ambiguous.
Oh, yeah.
So some health problems, some testimony problems. I can't remember all the details, but that was a complexity, that here are some new missionaries, and I'm supposed to teach them how to be a missionary and how to have a testimony and how to stay on their missions. And I felt like a failure. I baptized no one. And back in the day, the baptisms were kind of emphasized. Right. And I know that there were other things. I did introduce a couple of people who were baptized, and I strengthened the branches, I think. I
Yeah.
loved the people. And so all of those were rewards that
Yeah.
I think formed the direction that I would continue to go.
Well, you think about all the students that you've taught, right? I mean, that if I can call it, the spiritual gift that you had that was developing on your mission, was one that carried through your entire career and reaching out to people through all those students that you've had for all those years, and being able to help them either with aesthetic issues in one way or the other, literature and art, but also with issues in the gospel as well.
I have loved the bringing together of critical thinking and critical writing and research and analysis with gospel principles. It's just worked for me, I think, for my students in a way that I hope hasn't compromised either of those areas, but it's just this synthesis of the intellectual gifts that we are given and the heart gifts, the ability to love and to see the workings of the Holy Spirit and our Savior in our lives. I'll just mention another area of perplexity and ambiguity, and that's parenthood. And we have 8 children, and some of our children have struggled with various kinds of issues: pornography, drug addiction, doubt. And at those moments when you absolutely don't know what to do, you see this person that you love so deeply on a course of apparent self-destruction, and the tough love that is required to get them into the drug rehab program again and again and again. You pray in ways that you have never prayed before, and yet somehow the Lord is there in the home, and there were many ways that we were inadequate as parents, but we tried to keep going to church and reading the Book of Mormon every morning, despite great degrees of sleepiness among our children. And over the long arc of our parenting, those habits and attitudes seemed to work. They bore fruit. To this day, not all of our children are fully in the gospel. That doesn't keep us from being absolutely devoted to them and loving to be with them. And one of the great joys of our parenthood is to see our children's friendship with each other and their children's. So we sometimes think of the gospel in this kind of narrow, I don't want to say lockstep, because I love the ordinances. Sure. I love having those covenants. I love administering those ordinances. But for me, the world of the gospel is expansive. It embraces all those moments when my father stood behind me, showing me how to put my hands on the golf club, and that father smell, which was partly unpleasant but partly pleasant. And going to the wood shop with my sons and going on outings with my daughters, watching their lives unfold now as parents, and the gospel gives a sweetness to all of this that is undeniable. And I think there are many people who are not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who are happy after their fashion. They live good lives, and they do good things. But for those of us who have begun to taste the sweetness of the fruit, there really is nothing else that will do.
Right.
The kingdom of God or nothing. And for me, I've chosen to do my best to head toward the tree.
Well, and what is so remarkable about you, Scott, and I can say this from knowing you and knowing some of your children and knowing some of your students, that one of the things that you do best in your teaching, aside from all the gifts that you have and with the pedagogy in the classroom, is you teach best by who you are. And it's one of the things I've always admired about you is and loved about what you said is that sweetness that you feel, going all the way back to those moments with your dad and those moments with your kids, and it's not about how easy or difficult those moments are. It's just that those moments exist, and that they all become a part of this thing that have this part of your life that has brought you joy and connected to the gospel. And it's become really just a part of who you are. And that's the thing that I think we see in you as a teacher.
You see it, but I don't particularly see it. It's
just
so
trust me.
It's so close. It's so close.
Of course.
All I know is I know where I want to be, and I know when I see something that seems counterfeit or a detour or doesn't work. And for me, this model of embracing the complexity and the perplexity, but keeping sight of the ideal and that informed faith, that simple but informed faith, that's where I want to be. It's what works. The other stuff doesn't work.
Yeah, right. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.